On Tuesday, January 22nd, 2008, the Federal Reserve made an announcement it had not made in 26 years. Before the U.S. stock market even opened, the central bank cut its main interest rate by 0.75%. Not at a scheduled meeting. Not at the next one. Right then, on a Tuesday morning, in an emergency call. The night before, stock markets in Asia and Europe had fallen so hard that traders were calling it a global panic. The Fed answered the panic with the bluntest tool it had. This is January 2008. Hello, and welcome to Bitcoin Daily News. Today's chapter is the story of January 2008. This is the first chapter of a long series. We'll walk through the year before the Genesis block, month by month, looking at the world Bitcoin was being designed against. The first month of 2008 opened with a stock market in trouble and ended with a bank scandal nobody saw coming. In the first 3 weeks, U.S. equities sold off. Asian markets fell harder. By Monday, January 21st, traders in London were calling it the worst single day in years. The next morning, the Fed cut rates by 0.75% in an emergency move. Then, 8 days later, on January 30th, the Fed cut again by 0.5%. That was a full 1.25% of cuts in 8 days. Underneath the headlines, the housing market was unraveling. Subprime mortgages, home loans made to borrowers with weak credit, had been sold and resold and packaged into bonds across Wall Street for years. Those bonds were now losing value. The banks that held them were starting to admit it. Then on Thursday, January 24th, a French bank called Société Générale held a press conference in Brazil. The bank told the world it had just lost about 5 billion euros, roughly $7 billion at the time, on the unauthorized trades of one junior employee. The trader was named Jérôme Kerviel. He was 28 years old. The losses had built up quietly for months, hidden inside the bank's own systems. By the close of the month, the world's biggest central bank had used its bluntest tool twice in a week. The housing market was losing trillions in slow motion, and a single French trader had erased the equivalent of a small country's annual budget. For the people who would later be called Bitcoin's intellectual ancestors, January 2008 was a quiet month. There was no Bitcoin. There was no white paper. There was no software. The Genesis block was 11 months away. What did exist in January 2008 was a small online community of cryptographers, engineers, and writers who had been thinking about money on the internet for about 20 years. They posted to a mailing list run by a New York programmer named Perry Metzger. The list was called, simply, Cryptography. The traffic that month was mostly about software libraries and certificate authorities. Money came up sometimes, but not often. The intellectual lineage that would feed into Bitcoin was already on the record. In 1997, a British cryptographer named Adam Back had announced a small piece of software called Hashcash. It used a math puzzle to make sending an email cost the sender a tiny amount of computing work, as a way to fight email spam. In 1998, a young engineer who went by the name Wei Dai had posted a sketch he called B-Money, an idea for digital cash that did not need a central bank. In the mid-2000s, an American legal scholar named Nick Szabo had described a related idea he called BitGold. None of these had ever shipped as a working system, They were essays, sketches, and small experiments. There was a real-world example of digital cash that had shipped, and that was now in serious trouble. A company called eGold had been letting users send fractional grams of gold over the internet for almost 12 years. In April 2007, the US government had indicted its founder. In January 2008, eGold was still running, but its days as an open service were numbered. We know now that somewhere in the world, in January 2008, a person or a small group using the name Satoshi Nakamoto was almost certainly already at work. We do not know where. We do not know what was on screen. The first public sign of Satoshi would not arrive for a little while longer. This was not the month Bitcoin started. It was the month the case for Bitcoin was being made out loud in public by the system Bitcoin would later replace. In January 2008, every move that mattered in money happened by discretion. The Fed cut rates because a small group of officials decided, on a phone call, that markets needed help. A French bank's losses were absorbed because the bank's executives decided how to absorb them. The price of housing was held up or let down by the slow workings of accountants and risk officers inside firms that did not have to show their books. None of those decisions were illegitimate. They were human. Any one of them could have been made differently if the people in the room had wanted that. Looking back from now, the contrast is the lesson. The system Bitcoin would launch into the next January did not break that month. It did not break in March, where Bear Stearns failed. It did not break in September, when Lehman did. It worked exactly as a discretionary system works. By people with the levers that people had to pull. The story of Bitcoin is not that the system broke. It is that someone decided to build an alternative that did not run on discretion at all. There was no network in January 2008. No blocks, no nodes, no coins. The chain that would later run every 10 minutes was 11 months away from its first block. What did exist that month was the math. SHA-256, the function Bitcoin would use to fingerprint every block, had been published by the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology in 2001. Public key cryptography, the math that lets a person sign a message no one else can forge, had been worked out in the 1970s. Merkle trees, the way Bitcoin would organize transactions inside each block, were named after Ralph Merkle, who had described them in a 1979 paper. Adam Back's proof of work was 11 years old. All of it was sitting on the shelf. The pieces existed, but nobody had assembled them yet. Was Satoshi Nakamoto already working on Bitcoin in January 2008? We don't know. The first dated public sign of Satoshi is an email to Wei Dai in August 2008. The white paper landed in October. Satoshi later said in a forum post that the code was written before the paper. That puts active development in the spring or summer of 2008 at the latest, and possibly earlier. January 2008 is a plausible month for someone to be writing C++ in a quiet apartment somewhere. There is no record. There is no email, commit, no message in the archive that confirms it. What's on the record is silence. Bitcoin did not need the 2008 crisis to be invented. The Cypherpunk movement had been describing money on the internet for 15 years before any of this. Adam Back wrote Hashcash in 1997 because of email spam, not because of a banking crisis. What the crisis did was make the case for Bitcoin legible to people who had not been paying attention before. The intellectual case existed already. The crisis turned it from a fringe idea into a problem people could feel. What was happening on the cryptography mailing list that month? Mostly software arguments. The list was run by a programmer named Perry Metzger and had a few hundred subscribers. Academics, security engineers, a handful of writers. The traffic in early 2008 covered things like flaws in certificate authorities, debates over which random number generators were trustworthy, and side-channel attacks on encryption hardware. Money came up sometimes, not often. The list was the kind of place where a paper about a new digital cash system could be posted on a Friday afternoon and get read by the right people. That would happen eventually, but not yet. What was the Fed actually trying to do with the emergency cuts? Well, the Fed was trying to keep the U.S. economy from falling into a recession that was already starting. The cut on January 22nd was the largest single-day rate cut in 26 years. The cut on January 30th came on top of it, and together they pushed the cost of borrowing for big banks down by 1.25% in just over a week. The reasoning was that cheaper money would steady the housing market, calm the stock market, and keep credit flowing. It is a tool the Fed has used many times. It works on the financial system because the financial system is built to respond to it. Any digital cash systems actually working in January 2008? Yes, there was one. eGold. The company let users send fractional grams of physical gold to each other over the internet. It had been running since 1996. By January 2008, it had a few million accounts and was processing about $2 billion in transactions a year. It was also under federal indictment. The U.S. government had charged its founder, Douglas Jackson, in 2007 with operating an unlicensed money transmitting business. In July 2008, Jackson would plead guilty. The plea would close eGold as an open service. The lesson for anyone watching was that a digital cash system run by a single company in a known building was a system the U.S. government would close. What about the price of Bitcoin in January 2008? Well, there's no answer. Bitcoin didn't exist. There was no coin to price, no market to quote, no exchange to list. It's hard to imagine. The first transaction would not happen until January 2009. The first market price, a few cents per coin on a forum called Bitcoin Talk, was almost 3 years away. The interesting thing about asking is what it reveals. Nobody in January 2008 was waiting for Bitcoin. Nobody was looking for it on Robinhood. It wasn't a thing. Yet. So, the picture from January 2008. The Federal Reserve cut rates twice in 8 days. A French bank lost 5 billion euros on one trader's positions. The housing market was breaking in slow motion. And somewhere in the world, almost certainly, the math behind a different kind of system was being written into code that nobody had seen yet. Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate you spending the time on this first chapter. We're excited to get going. This is the opening of a long history recap series. The channel will keep walking through the year before the Genesis block, month by month, and then through every calendar month of Bitcoin's life from January 2009 onward. Subscribe and hit the bell to stay in the loop. The next chapter walks through February 2008, a quieter month in the financial press, with a steady backdrop of bank write-downs, a ratings agency downgrade cycle, and the cryptography mailing list still mostly arguing about certificate authorities. Take care, everyone. We'll catch you on the next one.